Hey guys, my name is Jillian.leslie, or you can call me Jill for short, and this is my research presentation on Killers of the Flower Moon. Okay, so this is currently my working title. It is History Belongs to Those Who Tell It, how the film adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon challenges the historical truth of Osage suffering and narrative trauma despite being told from a white perspective. So there's a lot to unpack in this title, and I'll definitely dive more into it in my next slides. However, I think it's really powerful to start out with history belongs to those who tell it, because a really big issue that I'm talking about in my research is perspective. And because this is also a film adaptation, this actually is based on a book, loosely based on a book. The book is kind of from a different perspective. This film kind of shows audiences a different perspective and kind of aims to show this history more accurately. So despite being told from a white perspective, like this issue kind of it directly relates to the Osage Reign of Terror, which is a really challenging and horrible part of our American history, but it's something I'll talk about in the next couple slides. So, my artifact is the film Killers of the Flower Moon. It's an adapted film from Martin Scorsese, and if you guys don't know who Martin Scorsese is, he's a very famous film director. He's directed and written films like Taxi Driver, Goodfellas, um, Wolf of Wall Street, Shutter Island, and this is his most recent film that came out in 2023. So it tells the story of the Osage people. This is taking place in 1920s Oklahoma, and it's how their land and money was stolen from them from white settlers that were actually coming in. And they were killing them, they were poisoning them, murdering them, basically for their wealth. So a bunch of white men who were settlers were marrying indigenous women and Osage women, basically to get their head rights. So if a white man, were to marry an Osage woman and kill her, he and his kids would get her head rights. And basically, they were just seeking money. And the land that the Osage were on was filled with oil. And at the time, the Osage were considered the richest people. So yeah, the film is shown from the perspective, however, of a man named Ernest Burkhart, who was a white complicit man who was responsible for having multiple Osage people and other people involved killed. And basically, what's different is the book actually is from the perspective of the FBI, which is something I'll get into in a little bit. Um, but however, his uncle Hale, he's referred to as King Hale throughout the film, he's basically the mastermind behind years and years of Osage killing, despite being an quote-unquote ally in their community. So he's very well liked, very well respected. While these investigations are going on and people don't know what's going on, people do trust him, despite him being the mastermind. As a result of their actions, they are sentenced to prison time. And Molly, who is Ernest Burkhart's wife, eventually passes away of diabetes. However, there's a big debate of whether or not she was being poisoned throughout the film. But yeah, I'll dive more into perspective when I talk about my thesis next. Great. So my main research question right now is, how does Martin Scorsese's film adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon, which focuses on moral ambiguity and systemic violence, preserve, I spelled that wrong, I'll have to go back and change it, preserve historical accuracy despite being told from a non-Indigenous perspective? So far my thesis is, despite Scorsese's film adaptation being shown to audiences through a white perspective, the film goes against the typical white savior trope by centering the narrative on Ernest Burkhart, a morally ambiguous white complicit man who acts as a front row witness and perpetrator in the Osage Reign of Terror. So I'll pause right there and break it down a little bit. Hopefully it's not too confusing, but it's very wordy. Big critique of the film is kind of how this adaptation it is shown through a white perspective. However, so is the book. The book is shown from the perspective of the FBI, and it's kind of accomplishing that white savior narrative, mainly because it's a bunch of white people that are coming in to quote unquote save the day, save the Osage. However, that was simply not the case, and telling the story from that perspective doesn't do much. So Martin Scorsese really wanted to challenge audiences and challenge viewers by showing the film from the perspective of a white complicit man who not only acts as a front row witness, but he's also a perpetrator. And that's what he does in a lot of his films. He not necessarily humanizes them, but he wants audiences to see the evil that we often miss out on in history. So the rest of my thesis is basically, as a result, there is a tension between love, trust, and exploitation, displaying how systems of racism and violence have allowed for the erasure of Indigenous history, in addition to the effects of health disparities and inequalities that continue to attack Native communities today. So that's a lot to unpack, and basically to the right of that text is what I want to add. So there's a lot more I want to add to my so what. But yeah. So far, here are my research strengths. I really think my focus is strong. I'm able to kind of talk about a lot from what I wrote down. The film navigates telling an accurate story about the Osage Reign of Terror through a white perspective, which allows me to dive deep and analyze specific aspects of the film, such as representation of the home space, various filmic effects, and breaking down key dialogue exchanges between characters. So that's something I'm really interested in doing. And then my concluding paragraphs, I'm kind of focusing on the effects today, and I really want to bring in that information about how there are a lot of medical disparities and health inequalities that persist today because of the Osage killings and how that affects Indigenous communities today. And I also really think there's a lot to talk about the final scene and how Molly, who is Ernest's wife, when she dies, her obituary mentions nothing about the murders. And because of that cycle of systemic violence and racism and the erasure of history, like we are forgetting as a society, like how important this truly is. So, yeah. And then here are some weaknesses of my research. So currently I'm struggling with organizing all my thoughts because I have so much and I don't want to mess up, but that's something I have to kind of let go and just kind of work on more. And then as far as secondary sources go, I'm struggling to find more than 6, but I hope to find that within the next couple days. So here are my 2 primary source interviews, which I had a lot of fun watching. The first one is the Cannes International Film Festival. That's where the film was first screened. It takes place in 2023 when that came out. Directly following the screening of their film, DiCaprio, Gladstone, De Niro, Scorsese, and the standing chief of the Osage, they all take turns talking about the importance of bringing this story to life on the big screen. Why is it important? Why does this perspective matter? And when asked by the media why Martin Scorsese wanted to tackle this film at such an old age, which is really odd of a question, but he said that it was necessary to take risks because there needs to be proper representation and how we're missing out today as a society. And I really think that's important, emphasizing that we need accurate stories being told. We need different perspectives. We need to be challenged as an not just as an audience, but as a society. And then the other clip is from the cinematographer. Rodrigo Prieto examines and analyzes various scenes, pointing out filmic effects at stake. So there's a big explosion scene where a home explodes in the film, and it acts almost as a turning point for Molly. There's a lot of moments that click and she changes, but after this moment, I think kind of leads to her demise. And I feel like there's so many important filmic effects at work. It's shot with an anamorphic lens, which is a very wide lens, which allows everything to be captured on a wide aspect. And also, it's shot with a lot of natural lighting, so it seems like you're kind of there. You're there with the characters, and it's very important as well. So here's a list of my secondary sources, and then here's an example of 2 of them I want to be using. The one on the left is What Killers of the Flower Moon teaches us about historical trauma and Indigenous health. So in this article, it's basically an associate writer for Yale School of Medicine, Isabella Backman, and she's arguing that the history of health disparities amongst the Osage and other Indigenous groups throughout history. So she's saying basically that there's been a long cycle of inequalities in healthcare, and a lot of Osage people and Indigenous groups throughout history today experience mental health issues and physical health issues, emotional issues, and they don't get the help they need, and how all the violence that took place back then in the 1920s still persists today, over 100 years later. I feel like that's a lot I can talk about in my conclusion or in another paragraph towards the end. And then to the right, there's another article I really want to use in my counter-argument called We the Killers, The Law of Settler Violence and Native Persistence Beyond Flower Moon. It's basically a professor of law at Northern University College of Law that kind of takes the perspective that goes against what I'm arguing, that criticizes the film's centering of white guilt over Osage autonomy, which is something really interesting as well. and how they are helpless and victimized, and that's how they're shown on screen, which I kind of argue against as well. And there's a lot to unpack as well. But for the sake of time, I'll move on to the next slide. And then where next? I'll be working on a full 10-page draft that'll hopefully be done by tonight or tomorrow morning. And I currently, in my final, quote unquote, final draft, have 3 or 4 pages, so I gotta write a lot more tonight. I also want to finalize my thesis and work on creating a new body paragraph that focuses on new body paragraphs that focus on different parts of the film. Write a powerful conclusion, and then find a few more reliable sources just to incorporate. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you're listening and you're also working on your research, I wish you good luck. But yeah, thank you guys.